and welcome to Booklust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is Spokane native Jess Walter, and we're going to talk about all of his work, but especially his new collection of stories, The Angel in Rome and Other Stories. Jess,
Hi, Nancy. Thanks.
born in Spokane, right? I got that right.
I am, yes. Yeah. Thank you for having me again.
Well, I love this collection of short stories, and I have I have lots of questions, but let's begin with you. You were a newspaper man. How do you think that? First of all, how did you make the transition to writing fiction, and how do you think that your work as a journalist affected or influenced your writing style?
Yeah, I suppose I was almost more of a newspaper boy than a newspaper man. I started as a 19-year-old. I was a young father, and I always had literary aspirations, but coming from a working class family, paying for my own college and suddenly a wife's college and having a child, I wasn't ever going to be able to afford to get an MFA and study creative writing. So I went into journalism as a way to build my writing chops and to see the world, honestly. And I couldn't have chosen, I think, a better education. The whole generation of of novelists and fiction writers that I admire came through journalism. And I think it's unfortunate that that path isn't still there. I feel like you're armed with your sense of curiosity and your ability to research. It teaches you to ask questions. You lose fear of publication. You can't come in to the newspaper editor and say the muse didn't strike you that day. You write professionally, and you learn to do it, and you learn how systems work. I think it made me a much better fiction writer. There's no replacing just reading amazing books and studying them and writing. That's the first thing you should do. But I wish every novelist had to go spend a year or two in a 1970s or 80s newsroom. I think it was a great way to learn your chops as a writer.
Uh-huh. One of the things that particularly struck me when I was reading the stories in The Angel of Rome is like your one-liners. I think that, I mean, they're not always funny, but they just encapsulate so much in like one line. And one of the ones that I was especially struck by was in the story about a young man who has to keep coming out to his father no matter how much the father has aged, and he now has dementia and he doesn't remember that his son was gay. But there's the scene where he's talking about, the main character, the young man is talking about first coming out to his parents, and he says something about I was just the same straight A student that I always was. Well, maybe not straight. And I thought, I just love lines like that.
I think for me, the writing process is often toward a line that makes me laugh. Um, and then I almost have to defend keeping it in. Sometimes I take a pass through. It's funny, in Hollywood they have what they call the joke pass, where they'll often take a script and give it to a screenwriter whose job it is to punch it up with a few jokes. And I almost have to do the opposite sometimes. I have to look for places where the humor maybe is taking away from the characters in the story. But I do often find myself, and I think I'm also drawn to the aphorism,
Yeah.
to a line that's sort of, and I find myself often in stories writing a line that synthesizes what the character felt in that story. So, for instance, there's a story called "Cross the Woods," in which, in this one sort of gentle moment, she ponders that perhaps all emotions come from the same spring: happiness, sadness, grief, pride, joy, and that. And when I get to those moments of synthesis, I always think it's kind of this communion between me and the reader, in which I discover what the story's been about, and if I can make the line work, then maybe the reader will take that same journey.
Are you conscious of the reader when you're writing?
I think only in that I think of myself as the reader as I'm writing. I don't think, "Ooh, who will like this story, or who won't like that story, or should I tone down the language, or should I do this?" I'm not really thinking that way. I think one of the gifts of becoming as I've become an older writer. I mean, this is my 10th book, and I've been publishing for 27 years now. And to find yourself at that place is to trust your instincts a little more. And if I think it's funny, I generally think the reader will think it's funny. If I think it's moving, I've learned to trust more that the reader will find it moving. I think in general, another thing that journalism handed me was clarity. And I think if there's anything that I want to give the reader, it's not that they're indulging my creative side, that they know what's happening in the story. I feel like clarity is the least you can offer any reader. Even if your goal is to make a story that muddies in some way, at least to make even that clear, that there might not be the resolution that they want, or that ends at a certain point. But I think that's mostly how I think of the reader.
Do you think that that everybody reads a different version of your book, and what does that mean to you? I mean, how do you understand that, I guess, is the question.
It's the thing I maybe love about writing the most is I sometimes think of it as a piece of music that I've written that you then have to perform yourself. I know how the notes should sound. I know where I think it should go. Of course, everyone who plays a song, it's going to have a similar version of it, but they're really going to bring their own life and meaning to it. It's one of the joys of writing a short story collection is everyone has a different favorite. Much with characters in a novel too, you find those stories that you inhabit in a way that are meaningful to you, and so yeah, I know everyone's going to read it differently. It was a big shock as a young writer that not everyone would love everything I did. You're sort of like a precocious 4-year-old walking in, with a broken cookie jar. Look what I've done, and the fact that not everyone loves it shocks you when you first publish it. And now I find it this joyful thing. People will say, "Boy, I loved this story," or, "This story meant so much to me because my dad also is suffering from Alzheimer's," or I identified so much with this girl in drafting, seeking out a terrible old boyfriend to lurch her back into life. Or,
Yeah.
it's really the joy of it is having people connect in different ways.
In this collection of short stories, I've always wanted to ask a short story writer this, but for some reason, I haven't ever. So you're the first. How did you decide what order to put them in? I assume there's some, well, I mean, it would be fun to say there's an algorithm, but I'm sure.
There is absolutely no algorithm, but
Right.
I always, because I'm a writer, I just always search for metaphor in everything. And to me, there are two types of short story collections: the yard sale, where you just put it all out there, and the album. And I try to structure them like albums. I want, for instance, with this one, I wanted to start with a strong story. And Mr. Voice begins, "Mother was a stunner," and it ends with the word father. And I always sort of loved the fullness of that. And then I really wanted the title story, "The Angel of Rome," which is this big set piece in the middle, to almost close the first side of the album. And then you turn the album around and it closes with another big long story, "The Way the World Ends." And so for me, it was almost two sides of an album, 5 songs on one side, 7 on the other, alternating short and long, alternating female and male perspectives often. That sense of variety, not having similar stories follow one another. My first collection, We Live in Water, was much more themed. They were all about sort of poverty and the people we look away from. This collection was much more about relationships and aging, about memory. And so making sure that those notes sort of struck differently was the key.
Have you ever had to like discuss with your editor about an arrangement that you want? Because
Yeah, I mean, Jennifer Barth edited this collection. She's terrific, and her. So I looked at the stories that I had published in about an 8 or 9 year period, and there were 43 or 44. And
wow.
so I thought, wow, this is going to be hard. And then I realized only 17 of them were any good. The others were just extended jokes, or they were very similar. Often you will write something that is a version of another story in here. And so I had stories that ran in Esquire and some great magazines that I thought were similar to other stories. And so the big help Jennifer was in I got it down to 17, and then she helped me sort of figure out which other stories maybe weren't as strong or did something the other stories did. And she sort of left the order up to me, but we agreed conceptually on those sort of, varying tone and voice. And some of the stories are first person, some are third person. There's one second person story, one you story in there, Before You Blow. And so just finding a place where they all kind of fit. And hopefully built thematically. And then because it's called The Way the World Ends, I thought that needed to be the last story. And Jennifer totally agreed with that.
Yeah, there's a great. I thought that The Way the World Ends was a really strong, just a really strong story with a lot of those one line descriptions. Describing. So it's about two climate scientists who are competing for the same job at Starkville, Mississippi, at Mississippi State University. My husband interviewed at Starkville way back in the 60s, and they weren't sure they wanted anyone from Ann Arbor, Michigan to come to.
Probably didn't go like the interview in the story, I'm imagining.
Right. Didn't tell me.
You probably shouldn't, yeah.
Right. But what I was going to say is there's one section, one line, one paragraph in this story where the main woman character, one of the climate scientists, says, among climate scientists, it's called pre-traumatic stress disorder, but the feelings are no joke: anger, hopelessness, depression, panic. A recurring nightmare in which you see the tsunami on the horizon but can't convince anyone to leave the beach. She knows scientists who have become drunks, who have dropped out and moved to the desert, who have committed suicide.
Yeah.
And, yeah, go ahead.
That's a difficult story. I tend to I think the key that I tend to write in is the sort of hopeful humor, and my kids especially feel as if they live in a sort of doomed world, and for a parent that's the most heartbreaking thing. And I wrote that story to say I'm going to look directly into it. I'm going to find those characters, those kinds of people for whom they have to deal with this every day. And the fact that it's been politicized, the fact that science has been politicized animates a couple of the stories, Magnificent Desolation and this one. When I was growing up, conservative was the person who trusted authority the most. And to me, science is authority. Science is the best that we can know about a certain thing at any time. And so to have climate scientists working so hard, devoting their lives to this, I wondered, where do they go for hope? And that's kind of what the story's about, is Anna, this character, trying to find the place that inspires her to do her job. And that I knew, sort of writing that story, that's where it would go. But to do that, you have to look right into the dark thing that we're facing, and the bit I wrote about pre-traumatic stress is exactly what many of these people have. It's a harrowing job when the world ignores or overtly rejects the work that you're doing.
And I think that that describes so many of us who aren't climate scientists, but we're living with that pre-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, and it's, and I think it's, as happens in the story, it's good to remember times when we do change, when we are capable of great things and great change. And to watch the clock tick and us not take action is terribly frustrating. But if I could give those characters in that story, again, I go back often and read the very beginnings of stories and the very ends of stories, and to begin a story collection with the word mother and end it with the word hope was just meaningful to me.
Yeah. So I'm going to read another sentence that I thought was fabulous from this same story, not having to do necessarily with climate, but having to do with Rowan, the other climate scientist. And I want to just see if this was one of the lines that you felt you were writing for yourself, because I felt you were writing it for me. This is Anna is describing her fellow climate scientist, and she says she puts him 5 minutes of grooming from being handsome. That's a wonderful description. You must have smiled.
I think one of the great things for me often is using fiction as a sort of telescope that I can turn around. And many of these stories, I find myself writing from the point of view of a young woman who's, seeing a man who thinks his beard looks, dashing, and the fact that she puts in 5 minutes of grooming, because 5 minutes is a lot of grooming if you think about it. That he might be further from handsome than he ever imagines. But I loved the way many of the stories hint at romance, at a certain romantic connection, and are really about something else. And the one thing I knew in that story was that Anna was not the target of a romantic connection, but was a professional working in this field. And I desperately wanted that to be what the story was about. And then when that, sometimes if you can faint that at the idea of romance. But yeah, that was definitely a line that made me smile. And I think one of the other things I've learned about writing is to write toward things that tickle me, or that make me cry. Many times I'll be writing and my sappiness almost embarrasses me, but I'll find myself in a moment with these characters where I just start crying and conversely laughing at a line like that.
Well, Jeremiah, one of the third main character, I think, in this story, is a very I mean, your stories are such lovely combinations of that humor, because I'm thinking about Jeremiah, who's, been out for 36 minutes or something, and yet facing these really moral decisions in their lives about that's going to direct.
Yeah, when I look back at those stories over the last 10 years, I found it to be a really difficult, hard time in the country, and personally, and for my kids. And a lot of wonderful things happened too, but my dad, descended into severe Alzheimer's. I had a very close friend commit suicide. The children grow up and move out of the house, and all that happens, and you process it in certain ways. And yet I found myself, as I said, really looking for hope and humor, and then you find yourself seeking out those characters on the page. Who gives this single mother hope on the night when she wakes up alone after she thinks her boyfriend left? Who gives a retired newspaper copy editor hope when a year after his wife has passed away? And then finding those moments and then writing truly toward them, not in some Pollyannish way, but really going through the depths of what the characters are feeling, and finding the connection that gives their life some purpose. That seems to be what the project of my short story writing was during the last 10 years.
How did you decide? Some of these short stories could have been a novel or or a novella. Did they come to you as a short story, or did
I,
you?
I think The Angel of Rome is a novella, honestly, just by its sheer length. I love to play with time. I love to flash forward in time and then come back, as I often do. And so I think you could probably call both The Angel of Rome and possibly The Way the World Ends novellas. But in both cases, they felt like the story was complete. The Angel of Rome, especially, I wrote that in collaboration with Eduardo Ballerini, who's this terrific audio narrator. And he and I were having this discussion about the way stories are written for the page, and then an audio version is, with books tends to be an afterthought. And we said, what if we, collaborated on something? And he had studied Latin in Rome when he was young. And I said, I'm just going to take that piece. I'm going to build my own character who does the same thing and just let this wild stuff happen. I grew up next to a drive-in movie theater, and I love genres of film. And I wanted to write a kind of madcap romantic farce around that idea. And then being a sort of young cinephile in the 70s and 80s, when I was watching drive-in movies from my tree fort on this tiny screen, I developed crushes on the most unlikely people like Isabella Rossellini. And so creating a character sort of like that, or like Monica Vitti, who's on the cover. And so as we worked through that story, and then I would send Eduardo pages, he would send me some notes. We would talk about how to voice the actors. And then I flew to New York, and we actually table read it. And so when it was done, I felt like it was so complete. And to me, it didn't need to be any longer. But I was also so pleased that I got to revisit the world of Beautiful Ruins without, having to dredge those sweet characters out of their slumber and try to put them through some other adventure. What if Pasquale solves a murder or something, or commits one? And so I was able to write about the same kinds of things. And with both cases, I felt like the story had come around and completed itself, just like some of the really short stories that are, like Cross the Woods, complete themselves in only a couple of pages. I really have this sense that they've done what they were meant to do.
When you're working on a short story, are you always working on a novel simultaneously, or?
Yeah, I would. I don't know that I would. Simultaneously isn't exactly the same word. It's not as if I have two keyboards going, like I'm an air traffic controller. But I tend to get stuck on novels, and then rather than just sit and stare at the page, or I've found it so helpful to step away and think about anything else. And so I might be on page 51 of a novel, and I don't know what happens next. And so I'll go write a short story in a very different voice, almost just to break the flow of the other thing I was doing. And I don't know if you've ever had a problem that vexes you, and as soon as you go wash the dishes, you get the answer. It's almost like applying some other mechanical muscles to another project. And so that's sort of how I sometimes use short stories, as these palate cleansers and these ways to remind myself that I'm a writer. You can get so lost in the story, you think you don't have control of it anymore. Well, there's nothing better than taking a short story, which you can pick up and mold. You can change the point of view, the subject, and that reminds you that you're a writer and that you sort of have some agency in determining what happens.
So I loved your description in the story about Boise and the couple who moves to Boise, and it just echoed. A friend of mine and her husband moved to Boise and said all the same things. Oh my gosh, we can get solar panels and this house, and it was so cheap, and all of that. So I just wanted to get that out of the way and tell you that just rang true for me. You're always described as a writer who doesn't, you can't be pigeonholed. You don't write in one genre, and you've always said that you write what you want to read, or you write what you're interested in, and you're interested in lots of things, and so you get books and I have to mention my two favorite of your books, which I'm sure you can guess what they are, but one is Citizen Vince, and I'd love it if that were made into a film.
Boy, you and me both.
So I think it's a natural, actually. And then The Cold Millions, which I thought was just such a powerful book. And I wanted to mention both of those because I hope people will go from this collection of short stories, The Angel of Rome and other stories, back to your novels.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Your early championing of Citizen Vince, I still remember, and I think we were at the university bookstore and you kind of leaned across and said, "You really did it this time." For a writer to, hear from someone like you, that it meant so much. And my wife too, Citizen Vince is her favorite. And that book has never not been on some Hollywood producer's desk. So maybe someday, I don't know, but yeah, uh, I don't know. I think at some point I even became belligerent about not repeating myself. It became like a sort of badge that I wore. I think I'm less interested in that now than I am in just really finding stories that move me in a way that goes beyond whether or not the book sells or it wins an award or anything, but just that has such deep meaning that I almost can't not write that story. And but by the same token, I do pride myself on almost always making the worst commercial decision that I could make as a writer. Whatever an agent said, what would make sense is to write a sequel to this book, I would say, that's the last thing I'm going to do. So that seems to be the only guiding principle, is that I'm driven by something other than what makes sense.
Well, I think that for those of us who have read and loved your books, the legions of us who have read and loved your books, you're making all the right decisions for us.
Well, as always, that means so much. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. Jess, thank you so much for being on the show today. The time has flown. Go get more tanned.
Angel of Rome, I have one right here.
Oh, me too. All right. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nancy.